Dear writer, you need to quit. This is the show that helps you know what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. My name is Becca Sine. I'm a Gallup certified strengths coach with thousands of hours coaching 6 and 7 figure authors, mid-listers, major award winners, and new authors alike. Because everyone needs to quit something. Anyone can tell you what worked for them. And of course, they say it might not work for you, but they can't tell you why. I can tell you why. Welcome to the QuitCast. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 13 of the QuitCast. Today we're going to be talking about something that we all struggle with on some level. Some of us are more aware of it than others, and some of us have no clue that this is what's derailing us from our productivity, from our goals, just sometimes from life. And that thing is unrealistic expectations. So, what is an unrealistic expectation, Becca? An unrealistic expectation is something that you hold to be true in your subconscious mind that conflicts with reality. So, for instance, if I stub my toe, it's going to hurt. That is a cause and effect. There are nerves in my toe that will tell me that I have hit it on something by being painful, right? So this happens and therefore that happens. It's consistent, right? Unless you have nerve damage or something else is wrong, and then that's a separate issue. But for the purposes of this, it's if I stub my toe, it's going to hurt. That is the reality of the stubbing my toe situation. So when I expect that it won't hurt when I stub my toe subconsciously, and I get mad because reality is conflicting with my unrealistic expectation, then I have all kinds of problems. I have cognitive dissonance sometimes, so it'll be, I don't understand why this isn't lining up the way that I think it should, which causes me to feel a frustration or to experience cognitive dissonance when the thing isn't lining up. Well, it shouldn't hurt when I stub my toe. Well, that's your unrealistic expectation, right? And so you'll get frustrated by that. For those of us who are more aware of our emotions, at most times the emotional impact might be larger. So if I get frustrated because I've stubbed my toe and it hurts, and I think it shouldn't hurt, then I will get more emotionally derailed. And we call that essential pain, right? And so that's a psychological concept. If you want to know more about it, I'll put some links in the show notes. But we talk about that a lot more in the Write Better Faster class. But for the purposes of today, I just want to talk about unrealistic expectations that we have and how they impact both our writing life and our career trajectory. Because I'm running into a lot of them this year, especially from people who have been in the publishing industry for a long time or who have been self-publishing for a long time. But I want to talk a little bit more specifically about unrealistic expectations that don't have a physical manifestation. So if you think about the way that we joke around sometimes about food not having calories, right? There is a underlying frustration that I can't eat whatever I want and not gain weight. So that underlying frustration, depending on how strongly you hold it, some people, when they joke around about food shouldn't have calories or I'm just going to cheat or those kinds of things, they're not actually really believing that we should be able to eat whatever we want and not gain weight. But there absolutely are some of us, especially depending on what our younger life was like, if you were an athlete or if you actually had an experience where you had high metabolism and you could eat whatever you want and not gain weight, and then it changed on you, right? So that unrealistic expectation is now conflicting with reality, but we haven't tweaked the unrealistic expectation yet. So there still is this frustration that I can't eat whatever I want and not gain weight. And that is just one example of that kind of psychological unrealistic expectation, which doesn't have the I stub my toe kind of physical manifestation, right? So let's talk about a couple that happened consistently in publishing. Those of us who got into publishing pre-2014, let's say 2011, 2012, 2013, remember that it used to be a very different experience in publishing, in self-publishing, indie publishing back then, right? So those of us who had the experience like I did, where, and several of the people that I know who got in early put a book up, didn't do any marketing, and it just sold like bonkers. And so that became our expectation that this is how it will work. And then at some point it stopped working that way. And some of us have adapted our expectations to be more realistic, and some of us haven't. And this is a very large portion of what I see in Write Better Faster, is this frustration that things are not the way that they were. And there's sometimes only a very subconscious knowledge that that's where this frustration, emotion, pain, cognitive dissonance is coming from in this situation. And it might be the constantly having the thought back to, well, when I released in 2013, it did X and now it doesn't. And then that frustration builds. And before you know it, you're watching Netflix, you're on Facebook, you've left your manuscript, your frustration has grown, and it's because you're holding on to this unrealistic expectation that somehow it's still going to be the way that it was when it was good. And it's not that way anymore because the industry has changed, right? And so there's this unrealistic expectation that's conflicting with reality. And instead of sort of logically recognizing that reality has changed and I have to release this, we continue to subconsciously manifest that. And so one of the things that I want to encourage us to do is, if you hear an unrealistic expectation today that you have, I want you to work on releasing that unrealistic expectation, because it will change your productivity. It will change the way that you feel about the industry. It will change everything. And all it is a change in thinking, right? It's not actually a change in what you do. It's just a change in how you think. But how you think is so important. This is the huge why behind what I do in my business, is because we're so guided by our thought patterns, and we're usually unaware of how guided we are. And so bringing light to those thought patterns is super important to me. And so that's just one example of the unrealistic expectation. I should still be able to sell like it's 2012. And those of you who don't have this, who did release before that, and you're thinking, I don't have that, just hang on, there are going to be others. So there are ways that we are motivated in our writing career and in life, and not everyone is motivated by the same thing, right? And so I have a feeling that as you listen to these different motivations and what kind of expectations they can produce, that one of them will resonate. And so I want to start off by being motivated by pace, by how quickly things move, and by getting things done, right? So when you're motivated by pace, that tends to be the people who are happier with a checklist, who are happier not taking a ton of rest because they feel a lot of stress when things don't get done. So they're super motivated by pace. When something conflicts with that motivation, for instance, you move, you get sick, someone you know or love dies, you get divorced, those kinds of things, and it interferes with the pace, then there's this unrealistic expectation that what I'm going through shouldn't affect how I work. I should still be able to work hard regardless of what happens. But when something major changes like that, it's going to have an impact. And you might just be feeling generally frustrated and not really aware of the fact that it's coming from this unrealistic expectation, because these aren't usually things that we tell ourselves out loud or that we're consciously aware of. Almost always, the way that I find these unrealistic expectations is we go to the pain point. What's the pain point? And you'll hear people talk about, I got stuck in my manuscript, and I'll start talking about why, and I'll hear this pain point coming out of, I broke up with my boyfriend, my husband or wife, and I got divorced. I got sick. My husband or wife got sick. My parents died, et cetera, et cetera. And there is this huge pain point for them, and they're not hearing that underneath that expectation, because they're so driven by this pace, underneath this expectation is that they think that reality shouldn't be what it is subconsciously. And so acknowledging that I'm getting so frustrated by the fact that my expectation is not matching up with reality, the only thing it's going to do to continue to hold on to that expectation is to frustrate you, because the reality is not going to change. And so the tweak of the thinking is what will make the things feel better. It will make things move faster and move, because it's possible to put our heads down and get through situations that are causing a blip in our productivity, instead of trying to be productive during those difficult situations. And again, not everybody's wired the same way. So if that doesn't resonate, that's okay. But I wanted to address that pace one specifically because it's one that I see a lot. This extreme frustration that I can't work faster than my life will allow. And while I understand the frustration completely, it's totally rational, it's actually causing more problems than it's solving, because it's not making the reality go away, and it's causing enough cognitive dissonance that it's making you distract yourself in order to soothe that emotional essential pain. And so again, that pace driver that's a consistent place where I see that come from. Another one that is so consistently bringing people into write better faster, which is so interesting to talk about, because this is one that I suffer from myself. And even when I say things out loud, I still am not sure how emotionally resonant it is for me, because I just believe this, right? So another consistent one is people who are motivated by things being good or right, correct. So let's call it correctness. So, and it's a standard of good or right that I have in my head. It may not necessarily be an external standard. So if I believe that books that are bad shouldn't sell, books that I think are bad shouldn't sell, or the books that I think are better should sell better than books that are crappy, that I think are crappy. I hear this so often from writers, the frustration that, but I write better than that. Why aren't my books selling? But I write better books than this person who's selling really well. And so because I have a standard of correctness in my head that I think is universal, that is not universal. And again, I don't have time to get into this because I'm trying to keep this short today, but your standard of what is right and good, when you value this the most, when this is your primary motivator, is only the same as about 20% of the population. And so there's 80% of people who don't agree with what you think is correct or right or good as far as like book quality goes, right? Not to mention there's genre differences and all these kinds of things. But when we're just talking about this primary motivator, so if I have an expectation that my books are better than the books that are selling, and they should therefore sell better than the books that sell well, then I will have this cognitive dissonance when those two things don't line up, because the reality is that my books are not selling as well as the books that I think are crappy in this particular situation. And so I continue to get frustrated because those things aren't lining up, because the reality is that my books are not selling, and I think that they should, and I think people are stupid for not buying them, et cetera, right? So that is that mindset. When you have that much frustration over the fact that books that are bad should not sell, that is an unrealistic expectation. And there are all kinds of whys behind that, right? The whys are because not everybody has the same standard of good. Not everybody likes the same thing out of books. What you think makes a good book is not the same as what everyone else thinks, or what other people in that genre think. And the reality is proving that out. The market is proving that. And we beat up a lot in the romance community on books like 50 Shades of Grey, and you'll consistently hear like from writers, that's not a good book. But by the market standards, that was a great book. It sold a ton. And then everyone will caveat it with, well, but it was a fad or whatever, like whatever they caveat it with, but the bottom line is it's sold and continues to sell. So and it's sold because people loved it and talked about it. And so there are plenty of people out there who think that is a great book, and they are not wrong about that. They're wrong according to whatever standard of correctness or rightness I particularly hold when I think that it's a bad book, but they are not wrong in the sense of their market dollars are spending and they're telling us what they think. And so if I continue to hold on to this unrealistic expectation, and some of you who believe this, who believe that any book that sells well, that I mean, insert here for 50 Shades, because it might be any book in your particular genre that you think is crappy, that my books are better than this and my book should sell better than this because they're better, right? Anytime you hold that expectation and then they don't, then your expectation doesn't match reality, you can feel the cognitive dissonance. Because if you look at your sales and then you see someone talking about how great X, Y, or Z book is selling that you think is crappy, you feel that gut response right away. You feel that frustration, and then that makes you need to soothe that frustration. So every time that comes up for you, because you're holding this unrealistic expectation, you're going to continue to need to soothe yourself every single time that reality conflicts with your unrealistic expectation. That friction causes pain, essential pain. And we have got to be more aware of this because it is ruling so much of what we do. A lot of us are spending time on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Netflix, anywhere, anything we're doing that we're trying to soothe that essential pain. We are spending and wasting time because we will not release our subconscious unrealistic expectations. So that is a big one. Books that I think are bad shouldn't sell is a huge one. I see that consistently. Here's another one that I see a lot. That person shouldn't have done that to me, right? So that person did something wrong and they shouldn't have done that to me and been able to get away with it. And I've heard this in several different kinds of scenarios, some of them with a publisher who had a bad contract or who ended up going under and people's rights got sucked up in that deal or something along those lines. It happens in individual partnerships and relationships a lot. It will be that person said something awful to these people about me and they shouldn't have been able to do that. There should be some kind of punishment, but it's long, long past and there has not been any punishment. There hasn't been any consequences. That person is not paying for what they did wrong. I've heard this in reference to a lot of author scandals where one party believes that the other party is wronged them, and then it becomes this big deal. And both sides will sort of use this rhetoric of they shouldn't be able to get away with this, right? Well, they did. The reality, again, the chair that you stubbed your toe on, the reality is that they did not get caught for whatever they did, or they don't think they did anything wrong, and all that kind of thinking is so damaging to you personally because you're holding this unrealistic expectation, and whenever reality bumps up against it, you are experiencing pain. It's the poison that you're drinking yourself, right? That whole concept of the fact that your unforgiveness or your frustration doesn't affect the person, it affects you. And so, and again, I know I recommend this book a lot. If you haven't read The Four Agreements, please go read that book. It's so important to know what's ours to own and what isn't. Because when we hold these unrealistic expectations subconsciously, we don't know that they're derailing us. All we know is that we're experiencing this frustration. And so when we hold an expectation that someone should have to pay for what they did or someone should get caught and they don't, then we derail ourselves by continuing to hold that unrealistic expectation. And I know that this is a touchy subject to talk about because there should be punishments for things. There should absolutely be fairness. And when there isn't, then we get frustrated so quickly because we want that to happen. And the wanting that fairness is not a bad thing. It's important to know the difference between when it's realistic for us to expect that there should be fairness and when it isn't. Because when it's realistic to expect and our frustration leads us to do something about that, because we can do something, we have the power to do something about that, then that's a good thing. Then releasing that frustration is not helpful because it's going to make us complacent to something that should be changed. But when we see that there's unfairness and there is nothing we can do about it, and there's nothing anyone can do about it because that person has gotten away with it and they're never going to get caught, and it's been decided, right? It's already been decided. Then we need to release that. The person who said bad things about you who didn't get in trouble, we need to release that. The person who did wrong against you in a critique relationship, we need to release those things. We need to release the expectation that somehow they're going to get what's coming to them, because all that's doing is creating cognitive dissonance in us, and it's making us need to soothe ourselves every time that comes up. So again, the purpose of talking about unrealistic expectations is not to sort of give you a band-aid, right? It's to address the mindset. It's really to address the mindset of holding on to things that are not going to happen. So one quick caveat, notice that I did not talk about things like I should be able to make six figures or I should be able to be a bestseller, etc. The reason I don't like to deal with those with unrealistic expectations is because unless you've decided to end your career, there's never a point at which you can't have a different career, at which you can't move to another level. It just doesn't work that way anymore. It used to be when the gatekeepers were deciding, right? They would decide to keep you out. But I've seen plenty of people who've had ups and downs in their careers who've gone up to six and down and back up because they hit again, right? So it's always possible. I never think that it's unrealistic to expect that you could have success. Whether you should, if you think you should have success though, and that's causing cognitive dissonance, that's a different thing. So thinking my books should sell because they're good, that's an unrealistic expectation because that's not why books sell. I mean, good books sell, great books sell, right? But there are plenty of good books that don't sell well because of timing, because of luck, because they released right after something else flooded the market, because the market is flooded, et cetera, et cetera. But there isn't an equal sign between good books and selling. There are good books that are released that don't sell. And so if that's the unrealistic expectation, absolutely release that. But should you be able to expect it in the future? Absolutely. There's nothing but possibilities in the future. And so I don't want to disabuse anybody of those kinds of expectations because we want to hope. Like I want us to be able to hope and not to despair. But the unrealistic expectation holding that is causing us a lack of productivity or that is causing us a lack of peace in our lives, those are the kinds of things that I want us to be able to release. Now, there are going to be tons of unrealistic expectations out there, and everybody's are different. And I'll tell you, they apply to everything, to relationships, to work, to our exercise, to food, to life, to everything in the world. They apply everywhere. And when you hold an unrealistic expectation and you won't let it go and it continues to cause cognitive dissonance, then you are going to have some of those more difficult, distracted behaviors that are going to drive you to be less and less productive. When all we want to do is say, well, this is reality. Reality says my books are not selling, and therefore I'm not going to be frustrated about that anymore. What I'm going to do is write the next book. And that's what we want to see to release, is to release the friction that those cause. And so how do we do that? So there are a lot of ways to do this, and there are a couple of different programs. In fact, there are 3 behavioral training programs that really help with skill building as far as dealing with emotions. And so I will recommend all 3 of those in the show notes. I think that we don't turn quick enough to behavioral and therapy in order to help us, because I think that skill building is super important. We did not all come out of the womb with skills. We had to be taught skills, and we all have skill deficits, and we need to learn skills. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But also I'll recommend those in the show notes. But just for today, I've been through programs before where we did work in this particular area, and what really helped me a lot was reminding myself every time the essential pain came up, every time the cognitive dissonance came up, that I can't expect something that reality proves is not true. I can't eat whatever I want and not gain weight. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to repeat that to myself over the years because I have this unrealistic expectation from having been an athlete in high school that I should just be able to eat whatever I want and not gain weight. And it's caused a lot of friction in my life over the years. And releasing that unrealistic expectation has been a lot of work. But every time I do that work, it helps me a little bit. It helps me get a little better at dealing with that frustration. And while I don't say that this is easy, it definitely is going to require consistent work. If this is something that has brought up a lot of frustration for you, this is definitely work that I would do. And it's going to feel a little untrue at first, even though when you first click over into that unrealistic expectation and you see it, you'll feel a little bit of relief, like, oh, I knew that reality was conflicting with my expectations somehow. I just didn't know how. Right? And so what we want to do is to do some repetitive work. And every time that thought comes up, every time that frustration comes up, instead of getting caught in the thought spiral and allowing yourself to kind of, we talk about it as going, if you think of a clock, we talk about it as going past midnight, right? Every time you feel this momentum that you're going to shift past the thought and then cycle back around again, it's time when you see yourself approaching midnight and you feel this call to action. It's time to say, I'm not going to think this anymore because that's not what reality is showing me. It's not realistic for me to expect that I could sell books the same way in 2019 as I could in 2012. As much as I wish that was the case, my wishing it was the case is only reinforcing the unrealistic expectation. And so my goal in this podcast today is for us to start releasing some of those unrealistic expectations that are causing us to derail our productivity and to get off into la la land and to get lost on Facebook and Netflix and to not work because we get so frustrated and we don't know how to regulate ourselves and get back to a place where we can be productive again. And so that really is this goal. It's just to talk about the fact that these are out there. I'm sure that this will come up again because every time we start looking at podcast topics, it's always what's coming up a lot in coaching, right? What's been coming up for people who are coming into the class consistently. And so addressing patterns is really what I'm trying to do in this podcast, is address these general patterns with authors. And so I have no doubt that we will talk about unrealistic expectations again. If you have more thoughts about this, please do leave a comment. Come and comment on the Better Faster Academy Facebook page, which I'll leave a link to in the show notes. If you are interested in doing more live chats, Q&As with me, where you actually get to sit on a phone call or a Zoom call with me where I'm live and can answer your questions, please check out the Patreon page. And I'm going to put a link at the top of the show notes for that. We've been having some really great discussions in those live Q&As where people are bringing things in and asking questions. And I have no doubt that the next time we do one, we're going to be talking about unrealistic expectations, because every time we do a QTP or a what to quit, we end up having these great conversations in the live Q&As. And so if that's something that interests you, please do come over to the Patreon. I would love to meet you and talk to you. It would be really great to be able to dig into your whatever question you have and be able to talk with a small group about this. And so if you are wondering on a deeper level about this stuff, I do have a class coming up in May of 2019. And if you're watching this later, you can go to my website and there's always new classes coming up. But specifically right now, there's a new Write Better Faster class starting in the beginning of May. We're going to be we cover a lot of this stuff in Write Better Faster and trying to help us uncover these places where essential pain is derailing us and how do we get better faster at this whole process. And again, this is really a mindset shift, and that's what I'm looking for. So remember to address your unrealistic expectations. Please join us in the addicts level on the Patreon for the live Q&As. And I hope that if you have enjoyed this, if this has helped you, please pass this episode on to your author friends. Help them to release their unrealistic expectations as well. This is something as a community that we need to get a lot better about talking about. And so I hope this has been helpful. Like I said, please like and comment, please share. If you would like more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button. And we will be doing a lot more QTP, a lot more what to quit in the future. Next week, we're going to return to the strengths for writers again. And so I will see you in the next QuitCast.